Welcome to Lancaster Environment Centre, Lancaster University, for this session of our online seminar programme. I'm Dr. Ali Burkitt, and I have the pleasure of facilitating this programme here at LEC. Keep an eye on the event page under About Us on our website for updates on future sessions. Also, look out for announcements on social media under the hashtag LEC Seminar. And of course, as we're here on YouTube, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and click on the notification bell so you're always alerted when we've posted new videos. Our speaker for this session is Professor Frances Cleaver, Chair of Political Ecology here at Lancaster University. She presented to a live virtual audience, and the session was chaired by Professor Gordon Walker. We join the seminar as Gordon introduces Frances to the audience, sharing anecdotes of when they first met at a conference trip to Oslo.
Event in Oslo that we were both invited to speak at, and it struck me then both what a fantastic academic she was, but also what a great colleague she would be for the people that she worked with. So I was really pleased to hear that she was interested in the job when it came up, that she'd applied for it, and then that we were able to offer her the job, and she accepted as well. So it all turned out really, really well. So it's been great to have her join us in LEC, and she's going to talk to us today about probably what is her biggest contribution to academic thinking in the field of political ecology and related work, which is on institutional bricolage. So over to you, Frances.
Thanks very much for the nice introduction, Gordon. Right, I'm just going to try and share my screen. So can you see that?
Yep, you just need to put it onto the screen, onto slideshow mode. Okay. Yep, that's great.
Okay, hello everyone. Yes, in this presentation I'm going to talk about my work on institutional bricolage, and because I'm not quite sure who I'm talking to, and I guess you're quite a mixed audience, I'm going to do this in two parts. I'm going to first of all just outline some of the origins and key elements of my thinking about institutional bricolage and the different ways it's been taken up in the literature. And then secondly, in the second part of the presentation, I'm going to highlight some of the areas that I'm currently working on along with colleagues in other projects. And these are areas that I think are promising ones for development. Okay, just to start with then, so bricolage is a term that's used in a number of ways in different fields, and just picking out two here. In the arts, it's used to denote a piece of art that's made from found objects or diverse materials, as in the cases shown here. And in France, the Monsieur Bricolage shops are do-it-yourself shops, home improvement shops. So the idea of a kind of piecing together through do-it-yourself. But in my use of the term bricolage, I'm borrowing from anthropologists, particularly Levi Strauss and Mary Douglas, to refer to the way that I think institutions for environmental governance are formed through the piecing together of arrangements. And this piecing together of arrangements draws on social and cultural resources to hand to a sort of institutional do-it-yourself or collage, if you like. And by the way, I'm just talking about institutions as sets of rules and practices that guide human behaviour. So they may be formal or informal, they may be social institutions, sets of social norms and so on, not just organisations. Okay, so why is this idea necessary? This is a bit of a complicated slide to show in a seminar like this, but it's taken from a paper I've written with Luke Whaley, which I'll refer to at the end. And I suppose just looking at the top right-hand side, the idea of institutional bricolage, which is right down at the bottom right, developed as a critique of mainstream institutionalism, and particularly the common pool resource theory of Elinor Ostrom and her colleagues. So I worked on that along with a number of other scholars in political science and culture and history and sociology, critiquing that kind of body of thinking for its very strong focus on getting institutions right and the ability to design good institutions for environmental governance. And so a whole kind of body of institutional thinking emerged, which was really criticising mainstream institutionalism, saying we needed more socially informed models of human action, like resource users aren't just farmers or forest users, they have all these other dimensions to their identities as well. That we needed to develop more realistic ideas about communities and the limits of community management or collective action, and in particular needed better understandings of how power works through institutions to reproduce social inequalities. So right at the bottom in the right-hand corner, we have this kind of body of critical institutional work, which is that deals with some of these critiques. And I developed the concept of institutional bricolage as part of that work. Okay, so what is institutional bricolage? So just to remind you, I was trying to develop a way of understanding how everyday resource governance, if you like, in my case, I was looking mainly at water and land, how these arrangements for everyday water resource governance are formed in the wider context of social structures and political economies and ecologies. And in a very simple way, we could think of institutional bricolage as consisting of these elements. First of all, I draw on the idea from Bourdieu of necessary improvisation, that improvisation is a necessary response to changing circumstances, and we all have to do it every day in our practices and our lives. People have to adapt and improvise to get by. So take the example of something I would be working on. For example, people in a village in Africa trying to manage their water supply. They have to constantly respond to seasonal changes in the water availability, to livelihood demands on the water source, to pressures caused by breakdown of other water sources elsewhere, shifting priorities of government and so on. So improvisation is just necessary in any kind of governance or management arrangement. And secondly, this idea that people piece together institutional arrangements from the resources available to them. So again, sticking with the idea of water in a village in an African country, the Water Point Committee may well be a hybrid institutional arrangement that people have pieced together from different elements. And these might include things like a constitution and a committee structure, because that's specified by government policy or by an NGO that's helping to fund the water supply. But they may well have rules about who can use the water and how much they can use and how much they should pay, adapted from accepted social norms and practices. And they may be piecing together elements of how they actually physically manage the water point from those existing social and cultural resources. But then the third element of bricolage is really important, because it's saying that any old pieced together arrangement won't necessarily work, that to be able to work properly and to socially fit, improvisations and innovations have to be linked to the acceptable way of doing things. They have to carry some authority or legitimacy. And so, for example, the head of the Water Point Committee, where it may well be the village head, with overlapping kind of sources of authority, or the legitimate decision-making arrangement, maybe a traditional meeting of the whole village, or the regime of payments for water maintenance and sanctions may be linked to generally accepted ideas that you shouldn't exclude people from water, and so on. So I think the thing that makes bricolage rather than just any old adaptation is the fact that the arrangements made through bricolage have to be authorised or legitimised in some way. And to my mind, that's one of the ways in which power is carried through institutional arrangements. Okay, so to me, I think institutional bricolage is a very good explanation of how people both creatively adapt and also reproduce power inequalities. So it's got these elements, if you like, of both agency and structure in it. Okay, so just quickly, I mean, the idea of institutional bricolage has been taken up in quite diverse literatures, and including family sociology, for example, which I don't actually mention here because I'm focusing here more on the kind of work that's in the sort of areas we're concerned with. So starting with the community-based management of land and water, which is where I started, it's also been taken up by people who work on, say, service delivery in urban areas or urban risk management, and also for looking at market-based approaches to environmental management. For example, how payment for ecosystem services rarely work out as anticipated by the planners, and how you can account for that in the bricolaging of arrangements as they go along. I'm not going to go through all of these, but what I want to say by this is the idea has been taken up and sort of run with in various directions, which is very interesting, and it's really nice to see. But I still think there's some areas that need further investigation, and those are the ones that I'm trying to work on together with colleagues now. Okay, so I'm going to talk about 3 areas of current work and focus. And this is the first one, the one about meaning in bricolaged arrangements. So I argue here that we need to pay closer attention to the meanings that are carried implicitly and explicitly through bricolaged arrangements, because it's these meanings that shape how they work in practice and also shape the outcomes in inequitable ways. Okay, so what do I mean by this and the meanings that are carried? Well, I'll just illustrate a couple of these through these pictures. On the left-hand side, the woman standing there is a treasurer of a water point committee in a village in Zimbabwe. And she's there at the water point collecting monthly payments for operation and maintenance of the water supply. And this is an arrangement that the people have come up with. They've come up with a differentiated tariff for how they think people are able to pay and so on. But as you can see, this is this isn't just taken for granted. People are standing there actually negotiating what they should pay and why they should pay with her, and she's having to enter into this. And the meanings they're bringing into their arguments, they're drawing on different discourses and different justifications for their positions as to what the payments mean, whether the payments mean that there should be a flat rate and we're all equal together, we're all poor together in this village and we're all in this situation together, or whether there should be graduated tariffs that recognise people who are richer or poorer, or whether there should actually be no tariff recognising people's human right for water and the non-desirability of excluding people from it. So all these different meanings are being invoked in this argument about the actual payments for the water tariff. Okay. And the second point, I think, illustrated by the man in the middle. This is a chairman of a water point committee in Uganda, and the water point, which is a borehole on a hand pump on a borehole, is situated on his land, and he keeps tight order for the community at that borehole. But the interesting thing about this is that the way he exercises authority is very much also shaped by his other identity as a traditional healer. And he's shown there holding his certificate from the government, which is certifying that he's a certified traditional healer. So in his traditional healing practice, he really focuses on marital disputes, and he particularly specialises in cases where the woman is dominating the man, or as he calls it, sitting on the man and exercising unnatural power over the man in the marriage. Now, I would argue that in cases like this, it's not really much surprise that there's not many women taking an active part in water management, because I'd argue that this man, in his exercise of authority at the water point, is also drawing meaning from the gendered social order that he reinforces through his practice as a traditional healer. So these meanings seep from one area of life to another. Another point I'd like to make about meanings, I mean, there's a lot to say about meanings in bricolaged arrangements. On the right-hand side is a picture of a constitution, and it's actually the constitution for the water point committee that the woman is collecting money for. So in the constitution, it just says constitution in English, by the way, and then the rest is written in Ndebele. So, but the writing constitution in English makes it sound more formal and official, apparently. In that constitution for the water point committee, the community have set out a tariff of payments, and they've also made up rules about what times of day people are allowed to go and collect water, who's allowed to be there, who's allowed not to be. And then, as you can see, this is made up and it's written out on a child's exercise book. But in order to give it more legitimacy, the committee members go around seeking stamps from local leaders and officials. So they've got the stamp of the chief, the so-called traditional chief. They've got the stamp of the ward councillor. And in a later example, they also go and get a stamp from the head of police in the district. So that's a very clear idea of the way in which people are bricolaging. They're drawing in symbols of authority to legitimise the arrangements that they're making. Okay. So that's one area where I think more work needs to be done, and I'm working together with colleagues on investigating that. The second area for development is that of technology and technological bricolage, if you like. So quite a few people have criticised the idea that or have critiqued institutional theory and institutional thinking for not being concerned enough with the material and with the technologies and infrastructures that also shape people's access to resources or whatever. And I think that's partly true, but it doesn't have to be true. And together with some other colleagues, I'm trying to investigate the ways in which processes of institutional bricolage and technological bricolage are entwined with each other. Okay, so I couldn't resist putting the nice picture of the man with who's adapted water pump from his motorbike motor to water his fields, which I think is great. So there's creativity and improvisation. But I think the picture on the right, which is from Algeria, shows that it shows a traditional well, which would have been a collective well of groundwater from which people took water for irrigating, has been adapted for institutional use by the introduction of these PVC pipes and electric pumps. And because of that technological adaptation, the community may well have to then revise the rules, the social rules, the institutional arrangements for taking water, for taking turns, or for monitoring who's taking what, and so on. So this idea that technological innovations or adaptations may prompt the need for more institutional bricolage, if you like. I'd like to share with you here, sticking with the technological kind of theme for a moment, but I want to talk about how technology, institutions and meanings are all entwined together. And for this, I'm drawing on Muna Dajani's work, research in the occupied Syrian Golan Heights. Muna's a colleague of ours here at LEC, and this is really interesting work she's been doing. So Muna's work investigates the way that the Syrian villagers who are excluded from formal water sources by the Israeli state, but they need water to irrigate their apples that they've traditionally grown. And over the years, they innovate with various ways of trying to access water. So they construct shallow wells or ponds, they try and collect water from springs, and they even try constructing rainwater tanks, which is actually against the law. So it's a kind of resistance in a way. But in the end, one of the things they've done most recently is demand direct water allocations from the water company. And in order to do this, they've had to establish cooperatives. They've had to set up some kind of institutional arrangement through which they will still manage the pipes and pumps. But this will enable them to get water to irrigate their apples. And it's very interesting here because I think it sort of suggests that on their own, technological innovations or experimentation doesn't necessarily work, that when it became linked with an institutional arrangement, then they got some results. They were able to get the water allocated to them. But also it indicates that these kind of processes are invested with meaning. So for these Syrian villagers, growing apples is part of their identity and their tradition. And because they're excluded from formal citizenship, they're not recognised as citizens by the Israeli state, then it's through apples and their connection with the land and with their traditional way of life that they can assert a sort of belonging and a kind of citizenship. Okay. So I think it's just trying to show how institutions are linked to the technology and also to these larger meanings, if you like. And just to mention that the picture here is drawn by a colleague, Christian Olmos Herrera, that we're working with on a project. And I think he very nicely tries to use these kind of pictures to reveal the spatial networks of people, institutions and technologies and how they're linked across landscapes. And through these drawings, he can do this in a way that we can't find one photograph that actually shows that, for example. So that's really nice. Okay, so the third area that I think needs development, and Muna and I are working on this with some other colleagues, is in terms of scale. So institutional bricolage has often been seen or critiqued by people as only applying to small scale village level dynamics, such as the water point management that I've already described. And I don't think this is a surprise because quite a lot of institutional theory about collective action suggests that collective action is more possible in small communities with where people share social norms and so on. But I think this is slightly missing the point, because I think through the micro dynamics of bricolage and adaptive practices, bigger processes are at play. Citizenship is claimed or denied, land and water allocations are affected, gendered power relations are produced. These are societal level processes. Okay, so local level processes of bricolage do scale up into meaningful social processes that we should be concerned with. But there's a very fascinating example of how practices of bricolage can lead to wider transformations of the political economy. And this is work done by colleagues Naouri, Cooper and Hattani. I'll give the reference at the end, in their work in the Algerian Sahara. And what they look at is the ways in which smallholders and artisans gained control over drip irrigation technology that was originally designed and supplied by big agricultural supply companies to quite large farmers for growing vegetables in greenhouses in the Sahara. Okay, and what happened was that smallholder farmers and artisans adapted the original drip irrigation technology so that it was more mobile and cheaper and more adaptable and could be used by small operators and sharecroppers. And they did this technological adaptation, but it happened on such a large scale, eventually affecting about 25,000 smallholders, farmers, that these technological innovations required shifts in the political economy, if you like, in the supply chain of parts to the irrigation farmers. It required innovations in the organisation of pumping water, and it also required the state to sanction new configurations of, for example, supplying electricity. So in this example, what happened was a shift from irrigated agriculture being the preserve of these landowners towards irrigated agriculture being undertaken by huge numbers of small-scale farmers, often sharecroppers. And this involved a shift in the whole agrarian economy, if you like. So I think it's very interesting to think about how processes of adaptation at the local level scale up to large-scale changes. Right, this is my last slide now. So those are the three areas I'm trying to pursue and develop in bricolage thinking. And I think just to end off with, if we're thinking about, I think the title was Transformations to Sustainability through Bricolage. So one question is that arises, and it arises from the literature, is whether if we accept a bricolage reading of things, does this mean that things will inevitably, there'll be adaptations, but that we'll always be reproducing inequitable power relations and so on? And there's quite a bit of literature emerging now about facilitated bricolage. The idea that, examining the idea that can you work with the grain of local arrangements? Can you recognise that people draw on these relationships and local adaptations and innovations and so on? And how can you selectively support the ones that are more progressive, if you like, and perhaps de-emphasise the ones that are more oppressive, to work with the grain to build these kind of practical hybrids that work and are socially appropriate and not too dreadful in terms of inequitable power relations. Okay, so I think I'll leave it there. That's probably all I've got to say for this time. I've got some references at the end if anyone wants to see the slides afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Frances. I'm going to applaud on behalf of the audience.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was great. And we've got time for questions now. So if anybody's got questions, can they please put them into the chat, and then I'll pick questions out and transmit them to Frances and so on. But to just get us going, I wanted to ask you a question, Frances, which is quite often when concepts travel and they get deployed and used, the originators can feel that they're being misunderstood.
Yes.
That there are things that people are not quite getting about what you intended bricolage to mean in this case. So what do you have a bugbear? Do you have something that you find that people consistently don't quite get? And if so, what is that?
So I think there's a couple of, so I'd say two things about that. I mean, I think one thing is we have to be a bit relaxed, don't we, about our ideas, because once they're out there, it's up to people to run with them as they see fit. It's not up to me to control whether someone's done a proper reading of it. So we have to practice being cool about that. And also recognising that when people express things in academic papers, they're so limited in length and things, they can probably only pick up on something, so not your complete ideas that you've developed in the book. But one thing I think I'd really like to say is that people often interpret the idea of institutional bricolage as just applying to rural communities in Africa, drawing on traditions of chiefs and worldviews involving spirits and witches and things like that. And I don't see that as the case at all. I see that bricolage is much more of a generic process that could be taking place or does take place in government ministries when policy is being formed, and in British situations. In my book, I talk about a case of Swedish environmental management that very much illustrates a kind of bricolage analysis. So I feel that's the one thing I'd really like to convey to people, and it would be nice to see some more examples that deal with developed north cases, if you like.
Well, there are some questions coming up that actually take us in that territory, I think. So I'll take them in order. Jan Babington, yes, asked a question saying in an early slide there was a stream of work from CAS, and a question mark of how they might link to bricolage. So a question about the relationship between bricolage and CAS.
I don't know about CAS. I think it was the slide on how it's a paper that I've written together with Luke Whaley, and we were trying to address what bricolage had to say in relation to adaptive governance that's come from a more resilient school of thinking, if you like. And so in that paper, which is in Ecology and Society, if you're interested, we trace those schools of thought as both sort of having one foot in the common scholarship, but developing down different trajectories. And one thing that we suggest is that because bricolage thinking has been much more strongly informed from social science thinking about power and power relations and process, that maybe these could be brought together with the adaptive governance from the resilience side in more productive ways. So I think that's what that slide was thinking about, but it was just a bit too much to unpack in that's probably a whole seminar in itself talking about that.
Great, thanks Frances. Rebecca said that you'd answered her question in the process of talking about your bugbear, but actually I think maybe we could come back to it. She says at the end of her question, says, are there analyses using your bricolage concept of with elites like politicians and government officials and so on? I mean, do you want to say anything more about that? Like, you know, do you see bricolage at work in the response to the pandemic? Don't answer that question.
That's a hard one. I think I'll dodge that one. But no, I think it's very interesting. And actually, in my book on bricolage, I deal with a case of the making of water policy in DFID and, you know, government policy making around water, and analyse that as a process of bricolage. But But also, I think Becca's asking about other analyses using elites like politicians and government officials. There's a really interesting strand of work, and I didn't talk about it, but I think it's really important, about interface bureaucrats as bricoleurs. And it's talking about people like, I mean, where it's work in Africa, it's talking about people like district environment officers or district water officers or even field workers as bricoleurs, and the way that they have to make policy work in practice by bricolaging with local arrangements, what's locally acceptable, what's being demanded of them, and so on. And there's some very nice work being done by Michael Funder and colleagues on that. So I think that's a really promising direction.
Great, thank you. Okay, a question from Mandy Stoker. Do you see this concept being associated with the move towards a circular economy, where the supply chain has to work together?
Whoa, I don't even know how to, I don't even know how to reply to that, because I feel like I don't know enough about the concept of a circular economy, but I already like the idea of circular. I like that. I don't know if you could elaborate on, somebody would have to make some suggestions to me about how that might work.
I mean, Mandy, did you want to come in on the mic? Come in on the microphone.
Hi. Yeah. It was actually a very interesting talk. Thank you very much for that. Circular economy is where we are being encouraged to take recycling further, where we take goods. Say, let's take a car, for example. So you have a car, and when it gets to the end of its life, you then have to take bits and remove bits, but then they go back to the supply chain and back round and involve other people to remanufacture things and make new things, be innovative, if you like, so that it prevents everything as far as possible going into to waste.
Yeah.
And what it relies on is a lot of cooperation along the whole of the supply chain, because it's not in the people who, and at the moment, it's not in the manufacturer's interest for bits to come back to them. But they have been forced down that route to say, well, how can we get those bits back, and who's going to remanufacture them, and then can it supply back in? But it means that there's lots of little people at the ends of supply chains that are having to work with this bigger organisation.
Thanks, Mandy.
So I think something that may be relevant here is some of the people who are writing about facilitated bricolage and so on are also looking at these processes of, you know, like multi-stakeholder arrangements, and how you can create or almost like find some commonalities across different stakeholders in those situations. And one of the things that I'm trying to think about is how you pick up on values that actually may mean different things to different people, but people can sort of coalesce around them and agree on them, and so on. So I'd say it might well be of relevance to the kind of facilitated bricolage thinking. Yeah. I like Duncan's question.
Okay, we can go on to that one. Yeah.
Go on.
Okay. From recent research on repair and circular economy, I'd suggest that oh, sorry, no, wait a minute. The question was
about
how important is the readiness to hand of the components drawn on in bricolage?
Yeah.
Or do different elements tend to be adapted or repaired to suit the new situation?
Yeah. So I think that's a really good question, Duncan. And I think, yes. So the whole point about readiness to hand elements for bricolage is that they economize on cognitive costs, don't they? You know, there's something ready to bring in. You don't have to kind of invent it from scratch and negotiate it and rethink it. But actually, what happens is those elements often are adapted, or actually something quite different, but they're given the veneer of the thing that already exists, the accepted arrangement. They're made to seem like something that people know and accept, even if there's something adapted and different. So you quite often get these bricolaged arrangements that look like a traditional arrangement or look like they're drawing on a particular social norm, but actually they're doing something slightly different under that, you know, that smoothing over, that veneer of those things. It makes it quite hard to dissect some of the meanings and so on there. But I think that's really important to recognise that different elements aren't necessarily what they seem. Yeah.
Great. Okay, another question just come in from Ruben. As rural communities and small towns urbanise,
Yeah.
do you foresee the bricolage arrangement undergo some form of transformations or dwindle?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, Ruben, thanks for that question. I think that's also slightly linked to this idea that, you know, again, bricolage is only something to do with people living in small communities and traditional settings. And there is a fair amount of bricolage work on, say, water delivery in, or how people access drinking water in towns, and the various combinations of formal and informal arrangements that they have to piece together to do that. Now, you might say that once things become more formalised, say the water corporation can reach everybody with their water supply and everyone's got a meter in their house and a tariff and so on, then the need for bricolage arrangements disappears in that sense. But I guess we're a long way from that with most, you know, certainly with cities in developing countries. And actually what you see is a vast number of really creative bricolaged arrangements for selling, accessing, reselling water, for example. Yeah, so I don't think it dwindles necessarily in situations of urbanisation.
Okay, and a question from Jacob. How is or can bricolage influence the work of traditional top-down development practitioners? He says he sees how it helpfully describes institutional arrangements and offers caveats for practitioners, but can you speak briefly about how it might shift development practice? Is it just more bottom-up consultations or something more disruptive?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really interesting question, Jacob. And I think when I've presented stuff on bricolage to people, say in ministries in Uganda or Malawi or Tanzania or whatever, or particularly people in NGOs, people who work at that, have some kind of interface with field work or with service delivery and so on, people really recognise bricolage as being something they do or something they have to engage with. But they often separate out that from the formal organisation and the formal requirements. So one of the things I think would be really interesting would be to do stuff getting those practitioners, if you like, policy practitioners, to reflect on their own practices, you know, where they employ bricolage, rather than following the blueprint. And, you know, like one thing that I found with my work with Luke Whaley and Evans Mutunga in Malawi and Uganda, for example, we find that ideas and fears of witchcraft really shape water governance arrangements locally. And yet field workers, NGO officers, government officers never really report witchcraft in their formal reports in their development agencies, because that's not seen possibly as the domain of development or something that's desirable in the development field. So I think something about working with those people to understand what they do with that knowledge, what do they do in practice with that knowledge, and to validate that kind of knowledge and think about how you might reshape it in practice. But I guess you've probably got far more ideas than me about that.
Great, thank you, Frances. Oh, and a question just come in from Nigel. are there special qualities, challenges of improvised interscalar vehicles or strategies?
Well, thanks.
I nearly read interstellar there when I first read it. I was thinking spaceships, but interscalar vehicles.
What's an interscalar vehicle, Nigel?
I'm borrowing that from a paper by Gabriella Hecht that I really liked, and she uses this concept of interscalar vehicles as anything that's a story or a device or a strategy that helps you shift across scales. And it just really reminded me of what you were talking about, that you know, I think your work and her work around really improvising things that move across scales just seemed a resonance. So
okay,
I'm just chucking it in your direction.
Okay, well, Chuck and I'll have to have a think about it. That sounds really promising. Thanks.
Brilliant. Good. Any more questions from anyone? Our time is roughly up, although we can be flexible with all of this. No, I think that has been some really good questions and a really fantastic introduction to all the work in this area, Frances. So thank you very much for that. And we look forward to lots more discussions of interscalar vehicles and related concepts in the future.
I've got my homework now.
Sorry?
I've got my homework now.
So, Ali, shall we finish there? Is that okay? Anything you wanted to say to end the whole thing?
I just wanted to draw people's attention to the next session in our seminar series, which will be from Dr. Montoya, who is from the University of London, specifically from the Institute of Latin American Studies. And this session is going to be a joint seminar with Lancaster University's Department of Languages and Cultures. So we'll be running it on the 24th of February, again at 1 o'clock, but we won't be recording the session at the moment, so you'll have to join us live to be part of it. All the details of the sessions that are in our programme are on the website under About Us. There's an events page, so you can have a look at all of the details there. And I wanted to say thank you very much to our chair and our speaker for today. I will get on to uploading today's session onto YouTube. Yeah, it'll be great to see you all in the next session on the 24th of February. Thank you very much to everybody.